Welcome to the Improve Work podcast. I'm your host, Daniela Tancău, an HR consultant helping entrepreneurs and team leaders build motivated, high-performing teams. Here we talk about leadership, employee motivation, and other topics that enhance your ability to lead, whether you are an entrepreneur with a team, a business owner planning to build one, or a leader in a company. You'll gain practical advice and insights from me and my guests, experts in the field and entrepreneurs who share their leadership experiences. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe to stay updated on every episode. Let's dive into today's topic. Hi everyone. Today's episode is about internal communication in companies, and we'll learn more about this from my guest, Alejandra Ramirez. Alejandra is the founder of Ready Cultures, and she helps organizations improve their internal communication. With a professional background in marketing, communications, and PR, she brings a wealth of expertise to us. In this episode, we talk about what internal communication is, who is responsible for it, common mistakes, and what can we do to improve internal communication, and much more. Let's dive in. Welcome, Alejandra. Thank you for being a guest on the Improve Work podcast and for your willingness to share with us your experience and knowledge on internal communication, because we'll talk about internal communication in companies today.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to chat about all things internal communication.
Me too. I'm excited about this. So first, what does internal communication mean to you, and why it's important in a company?
That's such a great question, and it's one of my favorite questions to answer because if you ask any 10 people, they're going to give you slightly different responses. And I think to answer what internal communication is, I think I first have to answer what culture is, because I think people always think of culture as a static thing, like a set of ways of doing things and a set of, similarities in a company. I think of culture as more of this like living, breathing thing, right? Like if you think about in science, to culture something means to create the conditions that allow for growth of whatever it is you're trying to grow. And to me, for culture to be successful, you need internal communication. And internal communication is how we agree to do the things that build whatever culture we want to build. It's what makes sure that we're all on the same page before we start moving. I think another example or analogy is, I think of internal comms like the nervous system of a company, right? If you're thinking of a body, it's what carries the signals from the brain, which could be construed as leadership, right? To the limbs and the
Yes.
rest of the body doing the actual work. And I think of it like that. And I think about it as more than just writing. People sometimes think internal communication just means sending emails, when in fact, it's how people inside of an organization share information. Sometimes it's talking, sometimes it's silence, right? Because silence says a lot as well. So the actions and the words both matter, and it's foundational to creating that trust and productivity that you need in culture.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So internal communication, when you think at internal communication, you have to think at a company culture and
Exactly.
to design the structure of a company's communication, thinking at its culture.
100%. Yeah, and basically what I mean by that is you don't usually hear one without the other, right? Culture and internal communication are very symbiotic, and they rely on each other to succeed. And internal communication is that sort of essential bridge between what a company wants to do and how people need to do it, and creates that opportunity for communicating whatever needs to be communicated.
Mm-hmm. And I know you provide internal communication services, so you adapt your services and your advices to each company's culture.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are some foundational elements to a culture and a company, which is that people are people regardless of where they work, right? So everyone wants to feel heard. Everyone wants to feel like they belong to something. And it's human nature to want to build community, right? Even as an introvert, I'm a huge introvert. I like my own time, I like my personal space, but I still enjoy connecting with people and doing things that to me feel like I'm working towards a specific shared goal. And you need to have both of those things working together to really align with culture. Now, the parts that shift are going to be, within a company and how I tailor it is the vision at one company may be different than a vision at another company, right? So I have to account for whatever that company's mission and strategy is to make sure that that's what's being communicated. But overall, what I offer is um, listening, right? An opportunity for third-party listening through surveys and audits that help companies understand how their internal communications is working or not working and how their culture is working or not working. Because again, the two go together, right? So if you have low employee engagement, you probably aren't doing a good job of communicating things. If you are doing okay on employee engagement, it probably means that you're communicating things very well. So both have to kind of balance and rely
Mm-hmm.
on each other.
Yes. So, taking into consideration that you stated that there are some fundamental parts of internal communication, what are the key elements that a company's management or a leadership team should pay attention to when communicating a decision that affects all or most of the employees? And I think it will be helpful if we take some specific situations. So, for situation, let's say the company is announcing a merge with another company, and a second scenario when the company needs to communicate a major staff reduction. This is a critical and unpleasant situation. So, how would you handle these types of situations, and how internal communication would be structured so the results would be optimal and with minimal negative effects?
I think that, so first of all, those are great scenario options because they're very common. I mean, they happen around the world, they happen often. It's the nature of, I guess, call it doing business, right? And um, I think that, and I've seen this, right? I've worked with many companies on either small mergers or larger mergers or large staff reductions or small ta staff reductions. Um, to me, the best thing you can do in any scenario is over communicate early, right? So let's take the merger scenario. Mergers are very public things. When a company announces that they're going to potentially be merging with another company, even before it's a done deal, right? A merger is announced or an acquisition is announced, and it takes months and months, sometimes years for a transaction actually to be close and to be official. And if people don't hear from you and they're just seeing what's in the news, they're gonna write their own version of the story. And usually it's worse than the truth, right? Because people tend to go to the negative scenario. So I always say in the example of mergers, to be transparent, right? Be transparent about the why, right? So, like I mentioned, transparent without transparency, employees tend to fill in gaps, right? With like worst case scenarios, and that's where rumors start. Sharing the vision, right, of the merged future. So, if people don't really understand or see the bigger picture, they're going to focus on short-term disruption as opposed to like the end goal. And that's going to lead to them to resist change, and it's just going to create more confusion. Um, Another example is you want to anticipate questions. Put yourself in the shoes of the people you're communicating with and think, how would you, or what are the things that you would want to know? And then align all of your messaging around that and create channels for dialogue. I use a tool, I have a framework I call the 3H framework for communication. and it stands for head, heart, and hands. And I always say when you are communicating as a leader, you want to make sure that you're addressing those 3 points. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is for head, that's the logical part, right? What are the details that you need people to know that are really important? And by the way, we're using the merger as an example, but this can be for any scenario where you're communicating change. So staff reductions is another example. What is the head? The details. The heart is the emotional part, the why, the what's in it for me, the part that really
Mm-hmm.
gets people on board with why you're doing what you're doing, whether or not they agree with you, right? And then the hands is the what, which is, or the how, sorry, I'm sorry, not the what. The hands is the how. The how meaning, how are people, like, what are the things that need to be done to get whatever the goal is completed? And so in the case of a merger, there are people that are going to leave by choice or not. All of these things are going to change working patterns. They're going to change scenarios for sort of what's been done previously and turn them into a whole new way of working. And all of those things need to be anticipated and communicated. But like I said, I think that the best thing you can do is over communicate because how you handle these changes define your company's character, right? People
Mm-hmm.
remember how you made them feel more than what you said. And it's, I
Mm-hmm.
think, really easy oftentimes for companies to think about what the media is going to say as opposed to how their employees are going to feel and get the work done for this big investment or these layoffs that are happening that are going to significantly change things. And if you focus on the media, there's always going to be drama because if your employees are not aligned internally, that that is going to write itself externally. So acknowledgement. So going back to the mergers, for example, like I said, be transparent, share the vision, etc. For major staff reductions, that's also really scary. And those sometimes go hand in hand. Mergers usually result in layoffs, hopefully not many, but it happens. And it goes back to this idea of lead with empathy, right? Be human. Some cold generic message is going to make you as a leader appear detached or inhumane, right? You're better off kind of leading with heart and speaking, the human impact directly. Um, Explain the business reasons without sounding defensive, right? Outline any support that's offered. So I heard a podcast where um, Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, was speaking about the layoffs they had to do during COVID. And they made a real effort to help support the people that were being laid off. They created an outplacement service. They created a network to help find people jobs again. And he communicated very clearly and with heart. And I think that that went very far in helping build trust among the people who were staying as well. So all of these things are really, really important. And I think people forget that element as a key piece to the success of a company.
Mm-hmm. And how would you plan this communication? Would you plan all the steps before starting the first pieces of communication, or would you adjust the communication plan on the way?
It has to be a little bit of both. I mean, there are certain foundational questions that you should be asking from the very beginning to help identify areas that you need to address, but everything is evolving, right? And things change, and that's why it's so important to communicate frequently as opposed to just one time and then that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Because as things evolve, you're going to need to be able to communicate. So in some cases, you may have a long time before whatever that thing is going to happen. And so, sure, you can start to communicate more frequently and think backwards from the day that you want to start kind of announcing the big changes. Um, but you don't need to have all the answers to communicate. People just want to know that they have someone they can trust guiding them through this difficult transition. And so, even if you're just communicating and saying, hey, listen, this is happening. I'm sure you've heard about it already. I know this can be a very difficult concerning thing. We don't have all the answers right now. We're looking into how we're best going to adjust X, Y, or Z thing. And then keep acknowledging and then keep updating. And so it's a mix of both because as question if you're doing it right, you're not just communicating one way, it's a conversation. And
Yes.
so based on what you're saying, you may get certain responses, and that may help then further answer questions in a later email or another update or whatever other touch point you end up using.
Mm-hmm. And considering the drama of this this type of situations, do you think that verbal communication is more indicated or is a must in these cases?
I think so. I think that people want to feel connection, and sometimes an email is a little too cold for that. I do think that there needs to be a more personal element. Now, if you are the CEO of a company of 20,000 people, that's a little bit harder to do, but a video is probably better, like a pre-recorded video is probably better than a written email in some cases like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because again, people want connection. But you also want to meet them where they are. So sometimes more than one channel is really good because it may be that the initial announcement is that more personal human touch, but then you have somewhere that you keep a list of FAQs that people can access, or there's other materials that they can look through at their own time. So it's a mix, but absolutely, I think the human element needs to be there, regardless of what the channel is that you're using.
Mm-hmm. And what types of team members or employees should be involved in such communications?
Ooh, I love this question. I love this question because it's easy for people to think that it is the job of the internal communications manager to do all of this. And the internal communications manager is really essential to this because they are trained in internal communication. They're kind of those experts at identifying and connecting dots between seemingly random information. But the reality is that communication is everyone's responsibility at a company. If you want things to work well, you need to communicate with each other. So if you're in IT and you're working on a product that's being launched and you're doing it in a silo, when that product goes live and you're not communicating it, are people going to know about the product? Probably not. And it's on you as the person in IT who is maybe responsible for this product to think about, I need to be communicating this with people. What are the things people need to know? Going back to my 3H framework, right? Thinking about, okay, what is this tool for? Why did we build this tool? And how is it going to be used? And sure, they can bring in the internal communications manager, or if they have a consultant because maybe they don't have someone in-house because they're smaller. Um, that person in IT still needs to be very involved. They can't just be like, "Hey, internal comms person, here you go. Please go handle this announcement." It's a shared responsibility if you want to do it well.
Mm-hmm. And yes, it's a shared responsibility. And who should initiate these kinds of communications? So someone should coordinate these people who are involved in a change or in a decision and in communicating something important for the team members. Should be the top management, the middle management, the marketing or the internal communication team, the HR team. Uh, oh, and of course, we have different company structure. Some companies don't have HR, don't have marketing, or don't have internal communication. Some have departments or employees who do all of this. But in general, what kind of team members should be involved?
If you ask me, I think that every company, no matter how small they are, should have an internal communications team lead. That's not always the reality. To your point, sometimes they're so small they only have like a COO or a HR manager. So I think who is responsible for coordinating everything is going to be very different for every company. What's most important or more important is deciding who that is going to be. Because a lot of companies forget to decide and they just start throwing things in different directions, and there's no one person keeping track of everything or coordinating, and that's where things fall by the wayside. So who it is can vary, but deciding who it is needs to be a factor in whatever it is you're planning. So if you're say that you are a startup, and I worked with a company like this, they're a startup who was growing significantly and they were bringing on a number of new people over the next year or so, and they wanted to roll out a new onboarding tool to help with onboarding when they hired new employees, and also for existing employees to have easier access to certain HR materials. And in that scenario, they didn't have an internal communications manager. I was brought on to help support with some of the additional um, creation of content and strategy. But the first thing I did when I spoke to the leadership, I said, who is going to be your in-house point person? Who is
Mm-hmm.
going to make the decisions about when things are going to go out and about when things should be stopped, or who is tracking all of this information? Because I don't have access as a third party to some of your internal systems. Maybe you can give me access, but we need to, before we do anything else, decide who is that point person that when there's questions that need answering and deciding, they will be that person to help either make the decision or know who to go to make the decision.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I was curious because here in Romania we don't have usually companies don't have an internal communication person. They have marketing or HR, and sometimes the responsibilities are common. So they work together on these kinds of situations and how to communicate internally. But usually it's HR who communicates with employees. And I'm curious how things are in US. Maybe maybe roles are different. Maybe the
I
intern.
think I think it's a mixed bag. I have in recent years seen a huge increase in the number of job openings for internal communications roles. I think that there's still a big misunderstanding in what these people are expected to do or not do. So inevitably what happens is you have one person for a very large company trying to kind of keep everything moving. And so um, that's also not sustainable. I do sometimes see companies, like you said, where there's marketing and HR and they're working together. Sometimes they don't even have HR because they're a very small company and they haven't even, there may be 10 employees and they haven't figured out the HR piece, and it falls on the product manager or something. And so it's a mix. It's certainly, I've seen exactly the scenario you talk about that is common in Romania. And that's why it's so important to be clear on who's deciding what when and who's responsible for these things. Because, I mean, that's foundational to communicating. If you're going to communicate something to people, you need to be clear about what you're communicating, who's communicating it, and why.
Mhm, mhm. What are the most common mistakes you've observed companies make when communicating decisions or changes in their companies?
Ooh, one of the most, or sorry, one of the biggest mistakes I see is silence. Like waiting too long to say something because it's uncomfortable, right? And to me, most of the mistakes happen when leaders avoid the hard stuff, or they assume too much, or they fail to invite conversation. And that's just not ideal because, again, if you're delaying a tough message, you still have to give the message. Delaying is not going to change anything. If anything, it's going to create more uncertainty and more fear among people. so that by the time you end up communicating, you're almost having to deal with a bigger issue as opposed to communicating and delaying instead of in the moment instead of delaying. Um, I see a lot of one-way communication where leaders talk at people and not with people. So they think of it as, oh, this is just information flow. So here's what I'm going to tell them, and here's what what they need to know. But there's no actual conversation or opportunity to get feedback or say, how is this landing with you, or how are you feeling about this? So that's really important to try to remember that these are people at your company and they want to have a conversation. They don't want to just be talked at. Um, and then lastly, I also just see a lot of inconsistent messaging where different stories from different leaders are going around because there is no cohesive planning. And there's certainly an element to consider of you don't want to sound scripted or rehearsed, but you do want to actually still have what the main thing is that you want to get across. So this goes back to the 3H framework, right? If you can answer what is it that they need to know, why does it matter to them, and how do they need to do or change what they're doing to achieve the work that needs to be done, that can then be taken and tweaked, into a story. Like maybe one leader is a big storyteller and is using it as an example somewhere else, but the core elements need to be the same because that inconsistency is going to kill credibility and it's going to just create more confusion.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that they do these mistakes once and then they learn and correct them? Um, when these mistakes happen?
It's a mixed bag. I've seen scenarios, and this is why it goes back to culture, right? The two kind of go hand in hand because leaders who genuinely care and want to help drive alignment and clarity are going to prioritize internal communication as a skill, as a tool that helps with whatever it is they're trying to get across. And they're going to do what they can to make it a success and make it a priority. And look, we're all human, mistakes happen. And to me, the best leaders are the ones who acknowledge that, apologize, and move on to whatever the priorities are. But I've also seen companies that, they say they're transparent or they say that they want to do these things, but the reality is that they're just saying these things because they think it's what they have to say, but then they're not doing anything to actually follow through with the things they're saying. So these values or these goals become words on a piece of paper that they hand to people. And so for the leaders who don't take the time to really absorb the feedback or even ask for feedback, that's never that's never going to change. And so they may make a mistake and they may not even realize they've made a mistake because if they're just having a one-sided conversation, they're probably thinking, "Oh, I did a great job. No one's saying
Mm-hmm.
anything." When in reality, everyone's probably too scared to say anything or they don't feel comfortable saying anything. So those tend to be this perpetual, you know, situation of a lack of communication breeds more distrust, and the leader's going to do what they do and not even notice it. So it comes back to culture. Ideally, you want to be at a place where the leader is willing to learn and accept feedback and apologize for their mistakes.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering because some people become entrepreneurs and they get to have a team in a short time and they don't have time to prepare for all that being an entrepreneur and team leader means. And this is also include HR, communication, marketing, and other roles. But they have to coordinate all these aspects of the business. How can they prepare to be better in internal communication and avoid these mistakes and others' mistakes?
So I think what you said raises a really good point, which is to be a leader. it can be anyone, right? It's not a title that's just the CEO. I mean, ideally, a CEO is a good leader, but you can be a leader with your own team. Maybe you're a manager and you're doing, you know, marketing for a company. Um, so, so the skills that are needed are the same regardless of your title. Um, and I would just say that to really be successful at this, you need to take the time and make the time for it. Because if you're not making the time for it, you're not going to be successful at communicating what you're trying to communicate. And so, in the example you said about maybe an entrepreneur that has a lot of hats they're wearing and they're doing, or they're a very small team, if you're looking to scale as a company and be successful as a company, you need to prioritize communication because if you don't, it's always going to fall back on you to get things done if you're not being clear about how to do the things to your employees. And so to successfully scale, to successfully run a business, you need to be able to, it's not even just letting go. You need to be able to say, here's what I need, this is how it needs to get done, and this is why it matters. And that has to be a priority because if it's not, you're not going to get very far. And you'll very quickly notice too. Like you'll very quickly realize that maybe you have an idea in your head and you're not communicating it. It's not going to go anywhere. The company's just going to be pretty static at that point. So the best thing anyone can do at any level is to prioritize communication, whether it's with one person or with many people.
All right. Good point. And it's a good advice in any area of a business because if you have a business and you don't know sales or you don't know marketing or you don't involve people with these types of skills, you will not get results or the results you want, of course.
Exactly.
And as you said before, internal communication is also about how team members communicate back to top management on or to their leaders, and also how they communicate internally between them as colleagues or as teammates in different departments. How can a company can structure its internal communication so this communication to be transparent, to be open and honest, so it's a good communication and gets the results that are expected?
So there's two pieces to that. And I think this goes back to this idea that culture is a living, breathing thing as opposed to this static way of being. And to reinforce that, there are the operational elements, right? So there's the tools and the channels that are used to allow for that information flow. But then more than about having tools, it's about also modeling behavior and building habits that support openness and clarity. So if you say you're transparent, but then you maybe don't send any emails other than once a month when there's like a big announcement and that's it, is that really transparent? If you say you're transparent and you send regular emails, but you also have tools like Slack or Microsoft Teams, or you do town halls or all hand meetings on a regular basis, and you do anonymous feedback pulse surveys or internal knowledge hubs through your intranet, all of those things are places through which people can gather information, but they're also places through which people can communicate and allow for that open flow of communication. And the more you as a leader model the behavior of using the tools and saying the things, but then doing the things you say, you're going to be in a much better place. And it really, you know, it's a good reminder that leadership sets the tone, right? So you want to be transparent, you want to be vulnerable, you want to encourage questions, right? More asking questions should be the norm, not the exception. So if you're a leader, you shouldn't just be talking at people like I mentioned earlier. If you ask questions, it'll help with connecting dots that you maybe didn't realize needed connecting because people will raise things that maybe otherwise they felt too afraid to raise because nobody asked them. And I think another helpful practice would be um, cross-functional updates, right? Sharing across teams as opposed to just these silos where it's like the marketing team is meeting. I'll give you an example. So when I still worked in-house, um, one of the companies I worked at um, was struggling with silos. So different teams just kind of did their own thing. So marketing was over here meeting, doing their own thing. HR was over here, finance or accounting was over here, and different groups did things differently. And I think people were frustrated because nothing was getting done. And one of the first things I worked on with the leadership team was to say, why don't we start cross-functional updates? And what do those cross-functional updates look like? So in marketing already used to have a monthly team lunch where everyone would gather in a conference room and they would talk about updates. And so we had the CMO invite the head of accounting at one of the meetings and say, hey, can you come with your team and talk about what you guys do so that my team can
Mm-hmm.
understand how what you do affects what they do and vice versa. And then another month they invited HR, and then another month they invited whoever, right? We had a list of people, and that allowed for natural sort of connection because people started to put faces to names. And then when they were doing the work behind the scenes, they were like, oh, I just saw this person at this meeting and now I know I can go to them when I have this question, right? So that cross-functional update helps build that connectivity that allows people to feel more comfortable with connection.
Yes, and they are more able to understand what they are doing and how their work impact other colleagues' work.
Exactly. It's so important. And I think as a leader, if you are, if you are the head of a team or the head of a department or the head of a company, it's easy to assume people understand things or see things the way you do, but you can't. You can't assume that because as a leader, you probably have more information available to you. And it's your job as a leader to take that information and make it clear for employees so that they know what they need to do. And what happens is if you're not sharing what's in your head, they can't read what's in your head. And oftentimes people don't naturally feel comfortable with raising their hand if they have a question or raising their hand if there's an issue. I think then that's the exception to the rule. I think maybe that's why I ended up in internal communication because I have no problem asking questions. It's how I learn. I learn by doing and I learn by asking. But a lot of people don't feel comfortable with that. And so as a leader, you need to be able to create that psychological safety by being the person that is explaining things and asking questions and starting the conversation, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, here's the thing, go figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us what are some indicators that internal communication is working well or not in a company?
I think there are some pretty straightforward indicators that can help with determining whether people are working effectively together and the communication's working. I would say that if people can explain the company's goals in their own words and how they contribute, that's a really great sign that your internal communications are landing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Usually when communication is working, there's less friction, right? People move faster, they ask better questions, and they feel like they're part of something. And it's interesting because I say that I feel like internal communication is the kind of thing that you don't notice when it's working well, but you notice when it's not working well,
Right.
right? When it's not working well, you're going to have high turnover, you're going to have lower productivity, you're going to have disengaged employees, a lot of confusion, um, low engagement. When all of those things are working well, you don't notice it because it's working well. And so internal communications is really sort of that unseen factor that helps with making sure those connections are happening. And so, like I said, When it's working well, they can explain companies' goals. There's alignment between what leaders are saying and what teams are doing. There's high engagement. Teams are proactively sharing updates or asking for input. And the messages that leadership is delivering are echoed across the organization, but more than just being heard, they're believed. Um, and the negative side of it, when it's not working, like I said, you will notice it very quickly. Rumors will start to spread faster than official updates. Employees are going to be confused about what's expected of them. Teams end up working in silos or duplicating efforts. I was brought in once for a company that was trying to operationalize how they communicated between offices and locations. And when I went in to look at things, the biggest factor we saw was that they were duplicating efforts because they were in such a silo that they had two different teams and two different offices working on the exact same project but not speaking to each other. So they were duplicating efforts and kind of wasting time and also feeling like what is the point of this? And
Yes,
so it happens more often than you think. And then feedback generally is missing, right? It's ignored or only surfaces in exit interviews, and people feel that, right? So if you say, I'm so transparent, we care about your feedback, please give us your feedback. We have an open door policy. And then if someone goes and says, hey, this is an issue I noticed, I'm coming to you because you said you're open to feedback, it could be something as simple as, I really notice that when people join the company, no one is taking the time to introduce them to other team members. And so by the time they've become accustomed to how to do things, they're already working in a silo, right? That's something that has come up as feedback before. If you say that feedback is important to you, you're going to say, thank you so much. That's really helpful information. Maybe we can work together to figure out a solution for how to change that. And here's how we're going to change it. And then maybe a month or two or three down the road, you can say, you know what? We heard from some of you, or we heard from one of you that this was an important thing, and we looked into it, and here is what we found. It may be that nothing changes, but the fact that you acknowledged the feedback, addressed it, and then explained why or why not you were doing something to change whatever that feedback was speaking about, that's going to build a lot more trust, just naturally.
for sure, because they feel understood, and
Exactly.
they get some actions after their feedback.
Yeah, exactly.
Alejandra, some final thoughts about this topic? Can you summarize some key points?
Sure. Sure. So I would say the biggest thing to think about when it comes to internal communication is that internal communication is leadership. If you are not being, if you are not prioritizing it, you're not being a leader at the end of the day because it is an essential piece of being a leader. The other thing I would say is that internal communication is essential to the success of a company's culture and to the success of a company's bottom line. And it's why it's so important to make sure that you're communicating in a way that's effective, that's clear, and that helps align people. And without that, you're not going to get very far.
Right, I totally agree. Without communication, we can't make things better, and we can't get our team members to be engaged and on board with the decision and changes that are made, even if this include also negative aspects.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for sharing with us your insights and your experience. These are very helpful, and I think that many entrepreneurs, especially and team leaders, can benefit from what you shared with us.
Thank
Mm,
you so much. This was a lot of fun. It's a topic I love talking about. I'm very passionate about it. It's why I decided to leave working in-house and doing this to help other companies. So any excuse to talk about it, I'm happy to.
And how can those interested to learn more about you and your services can get in touch with you? How they can learn more about you and your business?
So the easiest way would be to go on my website, which is readycultures.com. And that has my contact information. It has the 3H framework they can download that's free to download. And it just describes what I offer clients, which is the audit and the operationalizing and then the message piece of it. Or they can find me on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn pretty actively.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching this episode. If you found value in this podcast, subscribe to stay updated. I'm grateful for your support and hope to continue providing content that helps you grow. See you in the next episode.